This one's for all the marbles, everybody. This is it. The final football game of the 2023 to 2024 college football season. The biggest game of the year where everything you have is put on the line. The national championship game between two teams that basically nobody thought would be in this game at the beginning of this year. But as the season went on, they both proved that they were absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt national championship contenders and the best team in each of their own conferences. Now they only have one last hurdle left: each other. And today we're going to be previewing it. So, with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're previewing the national championship. So, just like always, we're going to go position by position, starting with the quarterbacks. And let's go ahead and start with J.J. McCarthy. He, in the Rose Bowl game, showed me something that I had not seen out of him before. And that was when they needed him to, he threw the football and he delivered. Throughout his entire career, when he threw the football more than 25, 30 times a game, it usually led to disaster. That was not the case this past week. This past week, J.J. McCarthy proved, in my mind at least, that when push comes to shove, he can actually be a quarterback and he can lead a team to victory by himself, by throwing the football, not just by having a great running game, not just by hitting some wide open wide receivers on busted coverages. No, he proved it all this week. He can throw the football when he needs to, and had it not been for his wide receivers letting him down on a few plays, his numbers probably would have looked a lot better, and Michigan might have had a even more convincing win than they did in the Rose Bowl. Now, the good news for JJ is that Washington's defense is not nearly as good as Alabama's. They do have some individual players that I think maybe would even be better than some of Alabama's players at their respective positions, but overall, as a unit, they are clearly inferior. And their biggest weakness is their secondary and their ability to defend the pass. So JJ might have the opportunity here to kind of go balls to the wall and throw his way to a Michigan victory. I'm not sure if that's what they're going to try to do, but I certainly think it's on the table. And I do think that it's something that J.J. McCarthy is capable of doing. I believe now that if all of the chips were in the center of the table, J.J. McCarthy would be able to either throw his way to a game-winning touchdown drive, or if need be, throw his way to a first down so that they can continue to milk the clock away. Michigan didn't particularly utilize him in the run game a whole lot. He did have two runs that were fairly big, including one that set up a 4th and short that Blake Corum actually converted. So that was a big play. But outside of that, it was really just the traditional run game, and it was pretty effective against Alabama. However, what was the big difference was the threat of his legs and his ability to scramble around and extend plays and make plays outside of the structure of the offense. That showed up 2 or 3 times this week. In fact, when he was forced to play in structure was when the wide receivers kind of started to let him down a little bit. I will also say this: J.J. McCarthy, in pretty much every big game that isn't against Ohio State, has made the one big mistake. Now, against TCU, he made several, but that's an outlier in my opinion. Against Penn State this year, he had an interception that was dropped. It was the last pass that he threw when he was getting sacked. He shouldn't have thrown the ball. It was a bad play all around, and that could have been the big mistake for that game. And against Iowa in the Big Ten Championship last year. He had the interception that made no sense. And in this game against Alabama in the Rose Bowl, his first throw of the game, he decided to not throw it to a wide open Roman Wilson that would have gotten them 5 or 6 yards, and instead decided to throw it to Caleb Downs for no reason. And Michigan got extraordinarily lucky that Caleb Downs accidentally stepped out of bounds before catching the football. So that is something that I think is a concern for Michigan fans, is that at some point in the game, he's going to make the big mistake. And he's going to force a football that has no business being thrown, and it's going to bite you in the ass. And you can only hope that that's very early on in the game, because after that, after he makes the big mistake, he doesn't make the mistake again. And he settles in and he goes to work. Like, you could tell from his body language during that first drive, he was not ready to play. He was rattled a little bit. You could tell by the way he was walking and the way that he looked at the defense. But after that, after he made the mistake and after it didn't particularly punish Michigan like it could have, Michigan gets a 3-and-out, or I think something like that. Alabama might have gotten a first down. And then they punt, and then they muff the punt, and then Alabama scores. And now JJ's got to answer, and he does. And pretty much whenever they absolutely needed him, they answered. So Michigan, I think, has a quarterback that they will be able to lean on in any situation and feel comfortable enough with him to win the game. Now, Washington, on the other hand, never had any questions about their quarterback. And I've been somewhat of a hater on Michael Penix Jr. this year. I didn't really see the first round stuff with him. Like, I didn't understand the first round hype so much. And by the way, I don't particularly see it with JJ McCarthy either. But this past game against Texas, I saw it. I saw Michael Penix Jr. play maybe the second best game I've ever seen a quarterback play, behind, of course, C.J. Stroud in last year's playoffs against Georgia. And that one game that C.J. Stroud had completely changed my mind on him. And it convinced me to go back and look at the film, knowing what he could do. And then it recontextualized everything that I saw him do, and he became my quarterback 1 in this previous draft class. Now, Michael Penix is not going to become my quarterback 1 or 2 or 3, but he is firmly in the driver's seat for QB4 now. I did go back and watch some Washington film this past week, but it wasn't with the sole purpose of just looking at him. I'll get to like a quarterbacks in the off-season video sort of thing. But Michael Penix is absolutely elite. We can stop with the whole narrative that he should have won the Heisman. That's absolute horse shit. Jaden Daniels is better than him, and he was a better player than Michael Penix this year. Nevertheless, what Michael Penix does well is unstoppable. Okay? He threw 7 or 8 perfect passes in this past game against Texas. Like, literally, it doesn't matter if he's going against the 2013 Seattle Seahawks secondary. Okay? Those passes are getting completed because they were perfect. And as I've said several times in this video, the reason that offensive players are more valuable than defensive players, generally speaking, is because elite offense beats elite defense. And if Michael Penix plays like he played against Texas, against Michigan, he's going to put up 400 yards. And he's going to have 3 or 4 touchdowns, and Washington's going to win the game very easily. However, he does have a weakness that I think we should talk about. And that is, if he actually has pressure and he's committed to throwing the football rather than scrambling, which is something new that we saw out of him against Texas. Don't know if that's what we're going to see against Michigan. I think there's a high probability of us going to be able to see that. But throughout the whole season, he was basically a statue. Like, I knew he was a good enough athlete to be able to run around and extend some plays, to be able to scramble for 5, 6, 7 yards, maybe a first down here or there. But he just, for whatever reason, never really did. So when he was in that mindset where I've got to stay in the pocket, the second he got any pressure, his mechanics went out the window and his decision making ability went out the window. And he threw a lot of very, very questionable balls. And if you want to see the game that epitomizes that very well, then it's Arizona State. Now, Arizona State was where he had it the worst. For whatever reason, he decided to throw several passes that were extraordinarily ill-advised in that game. However, blitzing him to get pressure is ill-advised. And I don't think Michigan is going to be able to get pressure with just 4. So I think there's a strong possibility that his quote-unquote weakness, where when he is under pressure and committed to staying in the pocket, then he does kind of throw the ball up a lot. In fact, 6 of his 9 turnover-worthy plays came when he was under pressure. But I'm not entirely sure that that's going to matter at all, because I don't think Michigan will be able to get pressure without blitzing. And if you blitz against Michael Penix, he's going to pick you apart, because he's so good at identifying where the blitz is coming from and then taking advantage of the weakness that that blitz creates in the coverage that the defensive backs and linebackers are playing. So I don't think Michigan is really going to be able to pressure this kid at all. And that means that not only just in this game, but also just in general, Michael Penix is better than J.J. McCarthy. And also, I think he's a legitimate first-round pick now. That single game against Texas completely changed my opinion on him entirely. I said in my mock draft video that came out on Monday, that I recorded before the playoff games had happened and even before the NFL games had happened that week. So in that video, I said I don't see the first round hype with Michael Penix, and I had 4 quarterbacks going in the first round and not him. But now I kind of see it, and I kind of get it. And one game can absolutely change the narrative on a quarterback. And I don't think anything that can happen against Michigan and their very, very good defense is going to be able to change my newly formed opinion on him, because I now kind of see it. And the fact of the matter is that if you can play the way that he played against Texas, then you're worthy of being a first-round pick at quarterback, okay? He literally played the second best game I've ever seen a quarterback play. He was unstoppable. He got whatever he wanted for 3/4 of the entire game. You know, in the fourth quarter, they kind of fell off a little bit, and Texas kind of gained momentum. And that's because they took the foot off the gas, which it's never advised, but it happens to everybody. Nevertheless, I am giving the advantage to Washington and Michael Penix at the quarterback position. The running back position is up next, and this is mainly going to be a conversation about Dillon Johnson and if he is healthy. I don't know. I saw, like everybody else, him get hurt and not be able to walk off the field. And I also saw a detail that maybe some people missed, but they cut to him when Washington was celebrating, getting onto the 4x4 or whatever that vehicle thing is that they put really injured players on, and drove into the locker room. I don't know what his injury is. I don't believe that's been revealed to the public, or at least not at the time that I've been recording this. I don't think it's been revealed. So if it is something major and him saying that he's going to try to give it a go, that does have a lot of vibes of like Blake Corum is going to give it a go against Ohio State in 2022. And then he got 2 carries and left the game after 3 snaps. So I don't know about that. If Dillon Johnson can go, I don't particularly see a whole lot of scenarios where he's 100%. But by a miracle, if Dillon Johnson is 100% healthy and can be 100% for this game, then this is a much closer conversation than I think Michigan fans would want to admit. Blake Corum, now we saw Blake Corum in the Rose Bowl step up and be the Blake Corum for 2022, and it's also, I don't think there's very much of a coincidence that we're now well past a year since his date of surgery. So I think that might have something to do with it. I also think having 4 weeks off for him to get fully healthy also might have had something to do with it. But for the most part this year, he has not been that same level of running back where he was unquestionably the best running back in college football in 2022. And had he not gotten hurt, probably would have won the Heisman Trophy. Nevertheless, that's in the past. We got to talk about right now. Blake Corum does not have the explosiveness that Dillon Johnson has. Dillon Johnson can take a ball the distance if he gets a big enough angle on somebody. Blake Corum can't do that. Blake Corum is probably going to run in the high 4.4s or low 4.5s at the combine. I think Dillon Johnson's more of a low 4.4 kind of player. Also, just physically, he reminds me a lot of Donovan Edwards. So if you're looking for a comp, Michigan fans, and you've never really watched Washington outside of maybe the semifinal game, he does kind of play like Donovan Edwards. He does have that similar sort of build where he can literally be a 3-down running back and never leave the field. However, I am going to give the edge to Michigan in this conversation here, because the fact of the matter is that even if Dillon Johnson is 100% and Blake Corum isn't 2022 Blake Corum from this year is still a better running back than Dillon Johnson. Dillon Johnson's very, very good. And I think if he maybe had a little bit of a better run blocking offensive line, then we would see him potentially have a little bit even better numbers than he has now. And by the numbers, he's probably a better running back than Blake Corum, but when you watch the film, Blake Corum's running against 8 people in the box and Dillon Johnson's running against 5 people in the box. So that matters a lot too. Nevertheless, all of the bullshit surrounding Michigan very clearly has a better running back room, and I think they have the best running back of both running back groups in Blake Corum. So I'm going to give the edge at the running back position to Michigan. Moving on to the skill positions, or the wide receiver positions, all 3 of them, and the tight end position. And this one's going to be quick. Everybody knows Washington has better weapons than Michigan. Not even close, not even a discussion. And I feel like in every video that I've talked about Michigan wide receivers I felt like I've just said that same line in every single one of them, because the Michigan wide receivers and to a lesser extent tight ends are extraordinarily underwhelming. And the fact of the matter is that they don't throw the football a whole lot, so it doesn't really matter. But I do think maybe this past week they showed me some stuff that I hadn't really seen. Like, they didn't look out of place against maybe the best secondary in college football with Alabama. And I'm talking about, like, athletically. Like, Roman Wilson looked like he belonged out there. And Colston Loveland, even though he didn't have a tremendous impact on the game, looked like he belonged out there. Tyler Morris, I didn't know he had that kind of speed to him, okay? Because Deontay Lawson, I think, probably runs a 4.5 40, and he was running away from him and other defensive backs that Alabama had. So I don't know if that is real. I don't know if that just came out of nowhere in this game because they knew that they had to have those plays in order to win the game, and they just kind of upped their play all of a sudden. But I think I might have been talking shit on this wide receiver core throughout the year a little bit too harshly. I don't think this is the worst wide receiving core of any, like, top 25 team anymore. They're still absolutely the worst of any top 10 team, but I don't think they're that bad anymore, because I've seen them now go up against a real football team and put up numbers, and more importantly, consistently look like they belong on the field. And as far as Washington's wide receivers, I think you've got 2 first-round picks in Odunze and Polk. I think this is a loaded wide receiver class, so Polk is probably not going to go in the first round. And a guy who, had he been healthy this whole season in McMillan, probably would also have been in that first-round conversation. But if he decides to come out, I think he's likely a early day 2 pick. This is the best receiving core in college football by a significant margin. Rome Odunze, even though right now I have him as wide receiver 2, he is still spectacular. And I think the conversation between him, Malik Neighbors, and Marvin Harrison Jr. is a lot closer than most people are going to be willing to admit. I think Rome Odunze is a top 10 lock in this upcoming class. Like, not a top 10 pick. Like, I'm almost 100% positive Rome Odunze is going in the top 10 this year. And he was a guy who I did work on for last year's draft class because I had a top 40 grade on him and everybody else had him going in the third round. And they were like, oh, I really want the Lions to draft him because they kind of need that bigger body X receiver type. And it didn't work out because he decided to come back. And now all of my plans of him being like my second round pick for the Lions in every video I ever planned on making last year that I didn't actually make fell through because he decided to return to school. Nevertheless, Washington absolutely has the edge at the skill positions, even though I actually think Michigan has a better group of tight ends than Washington, number 37. He's still very good. Moving on to the offensive line, and I'm going to get some people riled up with this one. I can almost guarantee it, because my take is very simple, and I think this might be as lopsided as the skilled position, but in the opposite. I don't think Washington's offensive line is that good. They're extraordinary at pass blocking. They're straight up bad, like not even below average, straight up bad at blocking the run. And even though Michigan is worse at pass blocking than Washington, they have an easier assignment this week as well, as opposed to Washington's offensive line. However, Michigan's offensive line is significantly better at run blocking than Washington's offensive line. I think Michigan's offensive line is the best offensive line in the Big Ten. I don't think Washington's offensive line was the best offensive line in the Pac-12 this year, let alone the best offensive line in the country. I don't think they deserved to win the Joe Moore Award flat out and straight up. They're not that good. Don't get me wrong. They're top 5 pass blocking offensive line in the country. I think Michigan is top 10, but Washington is top 5. They might be number 1. In fact, they probably are number 1. But they are straight up bad at run blocking. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're kind of undersized in the middle. Now, it hasn't been a problem because they're so athletic and so strong for that size, and it's not going to be a problem against Michigan's defensive line, mainly because it wasn't a problem against Texas's defensive line, which has just as much size as Michigan's along the interior, but they are a bit small, and that does matter in the run game, I believe. And because of their inability to run block consistently, I'm giving the edge to Michigan here by a fairly wide margin. I think Michigan, if you want to talk about the left tackle position, I think you could say Washington is better. But I think they win left guard. I think they win center. I think they win right guard, even without Zach Zinner. I think Carson Barnhart is better. And at right tackle, I think it's a conversation with Trente Jones there, because Trente Jones is absolutely fantastic. And I totally called it. I said from before the season, throughout the entire season, the 2 tackles that should be starting for the University of Michigan should be Ladarius Henderson and Trente Jones. But they started the year with the 2 other guys at the opposite positions from where they were good at. So, yeah, that didn't work out great, did it? But Trente Jones is playing now, and that's all that matters. And I really, really, really like him. I think he's a day 2 pick if he comes out in the draft this year. If you want to say that Washington's better at right tackle, it is what it is. I can live with that. But it's a very close and razor-thin margin. However, Michigan is clearly better along the interior of the offensive line. So, once again, Michigan has the edge along the offensive line. Moving on to the defensive line. I love Bralen Trice. I love Bralen Trice. I think he's a top 20 talent. He might not go that high because the edge class is very, very good this year, but I love Bralen Trice. I think he's a Pro Bowl caliber player in the NFL. Probably not year 1, but he certainly has a chance to be that year 1. I really, really, really like Bralen Trice. However, he's a one-man army along that defensive line. Like, if I were to combine these 2 defensive lines and rank the best players along the defensive line 1 through 10, number 1 would be Bralen Trice. The rest of the top 10 would be the Michigan 9-man rotation. Michigan's 3rd string nose tackle, Cam Good, is better than anybody Washington has along the interior. And I don't say stuff like that lightly, okay? I don't even think Washington's defensive line outside of Bralen Trice is that bad. Like, I think they're okay. I think they're maybe slightly above average. But when you're comparing them to the best defensive line in the country in Michigan, it really kind of does stand out the difference between the two and what they look like. And I think a major reason why Michigan's defense has been so good this year is because they can put four fresh bodies out there along the defensive line, and there is no discernible drop off in level of play. And that is an extraordinarily rare thing. Like, Alabama didn't have that when they were winning national championships. Like, they had their two dudes usually, but they didn't have the depth like Michigan had. And specifically in those Clemson games where they were just rushing the passer every single snap, you could tell by the end of the game they were tired. And Alabama didn't want to take them off the field because they knew the backups weren't that good. So having what Michigan has is frankly absurd. And this is, I think, genuinely in the same conversation as the 2021 Georgia defensive line. Now, they're not going to have the number one pick of the draft, or at least I don't think so. But I think Michigan might legitimately have 3 first-round defensive linemen, and another one that I think maybe could sneak into the first round this year in Chris Jenkins. And then the other 3 are Derek Moore, who I think once he's given more playtime next year, people will really start to see what he is, and that's a first-round edge rusher, along with Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, who I also think are first-round defensive tackles. So when you're talking about high-end NFL talent, even beyond that, of the 8 main guys that Michigan plays, I think 7 of them are day 2 picks or better. And then you have Braden McGregor, who I think goes in the middle of day 3. But he's kind of an outlier in this situation. And then even beyond that, they have a 9th guy who's also really, really good. So even though I don't think Washington's defensive line is that bad, and I do believe that Braylon Trice is the best player out of all of those guys that I've mentioned, even the 3 or 4 Michigan players that I think have a chance to go in the first round, I think Braylon Trice is better than all of them. Michigan defiantly has the edge along the defensive line. Moving on to the linebackers here, I think this is a very, very tough and very, very close decision to be made here. I genuinely think Washington and Michigan both have probably top 5 linebacker duos in all of college football. So I'm really splitting hairs here between who I think is better or worse than the other players in this conversation. For Washington, I'm mainly going to be talking about Bruner and Ulo-Fushio, and for Michigan, I'm going to be talking about Colson and Barrett. Let's go ahead and start with the Washington duo. They're very similar players, although Ulo-Fushio is A, better, and B, significantly more athletic than Bruner. Ulo-Fushio himself is the best linebacker in college football, in my opinion. I thought it was Edgerton Cooper for a while, and then in preparation of the Sugar Bowl, I went and actually watched more film on Washington rather than just watching them live like I did a couple of times, like when they played Oregon and Oregon State and Washington State, etc. I watched them live, but I actually went back and watched film on them, and he's extraordinarily good. And he's the best coverage linebacker in the country, and he has the speed and physicality to play sideline to sideline at not just this level, but at the next level as well. The one knock on him is when offensive linemen can get their hands on him, which is extraordinarily hard to do because he's good with his hands, A, and B, he's so fast that he's actually in the hole where the running back is supposed to be before the lineman has a chance to actually block him. Like, that's a consistent thing that I saw with him on film. However, the point that I was going to say before I went on that little tangent, when offensive linemen do get their hands on him, he moves out of the way very easily. And I do think Michigan's offensive line is the best offensive line, not by a significant margin, but I do think it is the best offensive line that this group has gone against So I think there's a possibility that Washington's run defense, specifically because of their linebackers, is feast or famine. Like, I think you could see 7, 8, 9 yard runs relatively consistently, and then all of a sudden you see 2 or 3 plays where the linebackers read it perfectly and Blake Corum or whoever is tackled for a 2 or 3 yard loss or met right in the hole at the line of scrimmage and doesn't get anything. I think you could see that. And the main reason why the metrics have Washington's defense so not horrible, like they're below average in metrics as a whole defense, is because their linebackers are so good in coverage and against the run. If you take Ulofushio and Bruner out of this Washington defense, this might be a defense on par with LSU. I think their linebacking core has that big of an impact on their defense. And Ulofushio is absolutely electric to watch on film. He makes all kinds of plays. He's absolutely elite in coverage as well. Now, moving on to Michigan's linebackers. Barrett specifically has taken a massive step forward this year. He's been the difference in this Michigan linebacking core between this year and last year. Last year, Michigan's linebackers were okay. Like, they were honestly the weakest link in that defense outside of the ability to rush the passer. This year, while they're not the strength of the defense and are probably, in fact, the worst level of the defense is the second level. However, that's because they have the best defensive line in the country and a top 5 secondary. I think Michigan's linebacking core is very, very good. I think Michael Barrett is someone who's going to play in the NFL for a very, very long time. He has a very specific and defined role, as well as being what I believe is going to be a tremendously good special teams player at the next level. And I think Junior Colson just has 10-year starter at linebacker written all over him. I'm not sure he's going to be a Pro Bowler or stuff like that, but I do believe he's a day 2 pick should he decide to enter the NFL draft this year. So this is a really close conversation here. And I do think that Michigan's linebacking duo, mainly because of their size, is a little bit better in the run game than Washington's duo. However, Washington's duo is, I think, by a more significant margin better in pass coverage. And having a set of linebackers that can cover like the Washington duo is such an advantage. It allows you to do so much on the defense. And because of that, I think Washington's linebackers are a little bit better than Michigan's. And I am splitting hairs, and it is very close. And I'm going to be honest with you, I think probably the best NFL prospect between both groups is probably Junior Colson, because I do think the NFL is going to knock Ulofushio for his size down a little bit. However, I think in college football that doesn't matter as much, so I am going to give Washington the edge at the linebacker position. When it comes to the defensive backs, I think that all sides can kind of come together of this conversation and be like, yeah, Michigan's better, but I really quickly want to dispel some rumors about the Washington secondary. For most of the season, their best player, their starting free safety, Cameron Fabiculanan, was hurt for the vast majority of this year, and he is very, very good. And I think probably the best safety of both groups combined. For Michigan fans, think of him as Makari Page, but way faster and way more instinctual in pass coverage. He, like Makari Page, moves around quite a bit, but generally speaking, he's either in the box or the slot position. And that's where he's at his best. He is someone who I think if he were to come out into the draft this year, could be a sneaky sort of early day 3 pick that ends up starting for a team year 1. Now, I'm not positive he declares for the draft. He does have another year of eligibility at least, so he could come back and increase his draft stock even further, but I'm just kind of giving you my opinion on him right now. And that's what he is. He's a very, very, very good player who I really genuinely like a lot as a football player. However, a lot of their problems stem from teams throw the ball a lot. So I think that overinflates their numbers and how bad they are as a passing defense. And the main point that I'm going to use to talk about here is the statistic known as passing efficiency rating, but for the defense. So passer efficiency rating on offense, we all kind of understand what that is. It's basically QBR by another name. However, for defense, it's a little bit different because it takes into account a lot of different things that aren't taken into account by just the total defense statistics or the amount of passing yards that someone has given up. And the stat is, by the way, I'll just give you Michigan's. Michigan in defensive passing efficiency is number 3 in the country, and Washington is number 32. So Washington actually has an above average to good passing defense. It's just that the volume of the amount of times that they're playing passing teams, A, and B, the amount of times that those teams pass the football because the offense is either up or scoring and they're trying to keep pace and match, kind of paints a different picture than what the truth is. Washington has a good secondary, especially when they're fully healthy, and they have a good passing defense when fully healthy as well. So I don't think the secondary is nearly as big of a weakness as it's being presented. Now, I don't think they're world beaters or anything. I'm not even positive that they're genuinely good, which is why I've kind of been saying above average to good. And if we want to use defensive passer efficiency rating allowed as a sort of benchmark, which I'm not sure it is a benchmark, but I think it's a better statistic than just looking at total passing defense. But if we were to use it as a benchmark, then Michigan would have played 7 better passing defenses in number 2, Ohio State, number 4, Iowa, number 11, Penn State, number 12, Maryland, number 14, Nebraska, number 23, Rutgers, and number 27, Alabama. So Michigan has played teams with the same quality or better passing defense than Washington, even though I don't actually think Washington's defense is all that bad, or at least their pass defense. We'll talk more about the run defense in the matchup segment of this video, but as far as the defensive backs go, Michigan does have the better group, even though I think Washington's badness in the secondary has largely been overstated. So, to recap here, I gave Washington the edge at the quarterback position, Michigan the edge at the running back position, Washington the edge at the skill positions or wide receivers and tight ends, Michigan the edge along the offensive line, Michigan the edge along the defensive line, Washington, somewhat surprisingly maybe to some people, the edge at the linebacker position, and Michigan the edge along the defensive backs. However, comparing two position groups to each other doesn't matter because they don't play each other. I basically just use the positional comparisons really to kind of get some points across that I want to say and talk about all of the players that are going to matter for this game. What actually matters is the matchups. And this is kind of how I see the matchups going. Washington's quarterback versus the Michigan defense, I'm giving the edge to Michael Penix. I think he's athletic enough to avoid the rush. He's not as athletic as Jalen Milroe, and therefore probably not going to be as much of a threat to scramble. However, he can still do it and hurt you. So that is something that Michigan is going to have to game plan for. And I do see a scenario where Michael Penix kind of ends up with like 50 or 60 rushing yards because the coverage is there, but when Michigan doesn't blitz, they can't rush the passer. So Michael Penix kind of just rolls out of the pocket. The coverage still is there, so he scrambles for 5, 6, 7, 8 yards and keeps the drive going forward. And I could see him having to do that a whole lot, and I could see it not particularly mattering in the grand scheme of things, and I could also see it being the thing that wins Washington the game. So I don't really know about that. That's not a concrete opinion that I have, that Michael Penix's legs are going to be the difference in this game. But I do think that it is something that Michigan may not be expecting out of him and therefore may not be prepared for early on in the game. Now, when it comes to Washington's offensive line versus Michigan's front seven, I think this is a dichotomy here, okay? I think in pass protection, Washington has the edge. Now, if Michigan blitzes, I do think they'll be able to get pressure fairly consistently because when they blitz, they've gotten pressure very consistently. They're one of the best pass rushing teams in the country when they blitz, and they're honestly, I think they're below average. Like, I think they're in the 70s or 80s in terms of four-man rush, pass rush win percentage. So basically, when they blitz, they're very, very good. And when they're forced to kind of just rush 3 or 4, they can't get home. And the film does back that up. However, in the run game, Washington is not particularly good at blocking for the run. And Michigan is one of the best run defenses in the country in both yards per carry and total defense. So I'm going to give them a defiant edge in run defense, and potentially, like, if we're blitzing, maybe it's like 50-50 and or 60-40 in Washington's favor. And because of that, I am going to give the edge in that battle to the Michigan front seven. But I do think it's kind of close and situational. And the Washington skill positions versus the Michigan back seven. This is what everybody's here to see. This is Ali Foreman, maybe the best secondary in the country against maybe the best wide receiving core with maybe the best quarterback in the country. And even though I do genuinely think that Michigan's secondary is elite and will be able to make things more difficult for the Washington passing game, really than they've ever had this year, except for outside of like maybe Arizona State. But I don't know what happened in that game. That game is an outlier. I don't think Michael Penix is going to turn into what he was against Arizona State, and I don't think the wide receivers are going to be what they were against Arizona State either. Nevertheless, the fact is that even though Michigan's secondary is genuinely elite, and I think they have 4 day 2 picks and 1 future top 10 pick in Will Johnson, elite offense beats elite defense, and Washington's skill position players are elite. Moving on to the Michigan side of things here. J.J. McCarthy, or the Michigan quarterback, versus the Washington defense as a whole. I am giving the edge to J.J. McCarthy. A, because he can run around and does have the ability to create at a very high level in case they do end up getting pressure on him, which I think is relatively unlikely. However, even beyond that, I do believe that J.J. McCarthy is a good enough quarterback to pass the ball effectively, even against a much better passing defense in Washington than people are giving them credit for. I still don't particularly think that J.J. McCarthy is going to throw for a whole lot of yardage, but I do think he will be good enough to go something like 15 of 20 or 17 for 27 again and be very efficient, pick up a few first downs, and maybe he has a touchdown or 2 as well. And that is winning in my book. Him being efficient, picking up 6 or 7 first downs, passing the football, I think is good enough to be winning against this defense, especially considering that that's what Michigan's offense generally does, and that's what they want from J.J. McCarthy. So if they get what they want out of him, which I believe they will, then I would consider that a win and an edge for Michigan. Now, the Michigan offensive line versus the Washington front seven, I'm giving the advantage to Michigan, even though I could see a scenario where the Washington linebackers are just so fast that they end up kind of wreaking havoc on this game. I could see that as a scenario. However, I don't particularly think it's likely. I think it will instead be moments of them breaking through the line or getting to their spot before the offensive lineman has the opportunity to block them and making a play. But I do think those opportunities will be a little bit far and few in between. And the Michigan skill versus the Washington back seven, I think I'm going to give this edge to Michigan as well. I think Michigan's receivers will be able to get open against this Washington defense, mainly because I think Michigan will scheme them open somehow. I think they'll go through the film and they'll be like, okay, these are the plays that have worked consistently and throughout the whole year, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to run a lot of play action, and play action is going to help this team because I think the run game is really, really going to be there. And I think that the Michigan skill position group is better maybe than anybody has been giving them credit for, specifically at the wide receiver position. Like, Roman Wilson is legitimately good, and there are not very many football teams in the country where Roman Wilson does not start on. And there is no team in the country where Roman Wilson is not in the two deep for. So he's legitimately very good. I think Cornelius Johnson is a little bit underrated in terms of being a guy that's just very dependable and blocks very well. I think Colston Loveland is someone who has legitimate first-round NFL talent in terms of size, athleticism, and movement ability. AJ Barner is also maybe even a day two pick in a weaker tight end class this upcoming year. And there are some genuinely talented young players like Samaj Morgan and Tyler Morris that maybe, given the opportunity, will be able to show that they are better athletes than a lot of people have anticipated seeing in the Michigan. Basically, when it comes to Washington's offense, I do think they will be able to move the ball. I do think they may hit a big play or two throughout the game. And I do think that they will be able to put up points against this vaunted Michigan defense. I'm not positive they're going to be able to run the ball. However, I don't particularly think that matters, because there is no real difference between throwing for 350 yards and throwing for 200 yards and rushing for 150. So I do think Washington will be able to score, and they will be able to put up points, and they will at times look like an offense that Michigan hasn't seen this year. And there will be times during this game, I think the most likely time for when that is going to be coming out of the second half, where it looks like Washington's finally turned it on and figured it out, and that they're going to take over the game by just being dominant throwing the football. However, I think there's a definitive possibility that Michigan might just be able to do whatever they want on offense as well. And I think that mainly stems from the fact that Washington's run defense is absolutely horrible, like genuinely bad. And that's not the narrative that's going around in this game. However, I would like to use this as a teaching moment for people, okay? When you look at total rush defense, Washington is 41st, and they give up just about 4.4 yards per carry, and on average 137.1 yards per game. That is good for 41st in the country. And 4.4 yards per carry is 49th. So Washington's defense isn't actually that bad, right? Well, when I watched the film, I didn't think that was the case. So in order to kind of get the statistics to back up what my eyes saw, I went to collegefootballnerds.com, which is a fabulous site ran by two YouTubers called College Football Nerds. You can look them up on YouTube if you don't know about them. They're very, very good at what they do, even though I think some of the conclusions that they come to are a little bit weird. They have the best computer model in terms of predicting the outcomes of games on the internet and in existence, most likely. And they also have a whole bunch of statistics that you can't find anywhere else. And these statistics take into account relative performance. So if you play the best 5 teams in the country at running the football and give up 150 yards per game, well, okay, those guys average 220 yards per game. So you're actually a really, really good run defense, but giving up 150 yards per game is going to put you in like the 80s to early 100s in college football in terms of ranking best yards per game rush defenses to worst yards per game rush defenses. So their model and their statistics takes stuff like that into account. And Washington is 82nd in that metric in terms of a relative yards per carry metric. However, interestingly enough, they are 46th in the country in a relative yards per game metric. However, when you watch the film, it's very clear that this is a genuinely bad running defense that teams have to abandon because Washington is scoring the football at such a high rate. So I think there's a definitive possibility that Washington's defense, and specifically their rushing defense, is actually worse than that, and that their passing defense is the strength of their defense as a whole. And I think if they didn't have the elite offense, we would be talking about how Washington's run defense is a lot worse than it currently is being talked about. And when you factor in the fact that Michigan has the 26th best rush offense versus expectation in the country and the 19th yards per carry rushing offense versus expectation, which leads me into my prediction for this game. And I'm going to tell you why I think it's going to be like this. My official prediction for this game is Michigan 31, Washington 28. However, I don't think it's actually going to be that close. This is the way I see this game going. And I may be wrong. There is a legitimate scenario where Washington's passing game is just too much for Michigan, and Michael Penix is just throwing 6 or 7, maybe 8 or 9 even perfect passes that are down the field and getting 30, 40 yards each time that they're doing it. If that happens, Washington wins this game by double digits. So there is a scenario where Washington wins in a blowout. And I also think there's a scenario where this game plays out a lot like Michigan versus Ohio State in 2022 or 2021, where Michigan just physically dominates Washington and they're able to ball control and rush their way to victory by multiple scores. However, I don't think that's what happens. I think this isn't going to be a close game. I think Michigan, pretty much wire to wire, is going to be in control of the game. Because I think early on, I think both sides are going to make a mistake. Not the interception or fumble mistake or dropping a pass or a bad play call mistake. I think they're both going to make game plan mistakes. I think Washington is going to come out here, and they know everything that I've already presented to you. They know their secondary is better than people want to admit, and they know their rushing defense is the actual weakness of this team. They also know that Michigan wants to run the football. So I think the Washington offense is going to come into this game thinking we have to protect our defense a little bit here. So we're not going to chuck it deep necessarily as much. We might take a shot early on if we get a first down or two and then take a shot. And if you connect, that's great. If you don't, then it's second down and you move on with your life. I think that's a mistake. I think the first play of the game, the second play of the game, and the third play of the game should all be deep shots. However, that's not what's going to happen. Or, well, I guess I don't know it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. I think Washington is going to sit down and realize we need to have sustained drives to keep our defense off the field, because there's a real possibility that Michigan takes 3, 4, maybe even 5 minutes off the clock. Even if they don't score or have to kick a field goal instead of a touchdown, taking that time off the clock and being able to get 3 or 4 first downs is going to pay dividends later in the game, because Washington's defense gets tired late in games. You saw it against Texas, where they pretty much had dominated the majority of the second half, and then all of a sudden, the last 3 drives, they completely fell apart, and it was very obvious that they were tired. So I think that Washington is going to make the mistake of saying we have to be able to matriculate the ball down the field and move the ball that way. By doing that, you play into Michigan's hands because Michigan has the best group of tackling secondary players in the country. They don't give up a whole lot of yak. On the opposite side of that, I think there's a scenario where Michigan's offense comes out against Washington's defense and decides, hey, we're going to throw the ball on the first 3 plays of the game. And that would definitely be a mistake, in my opinion, because Michigan's passing offense, when they're actually just setting back and passing the football, isn't very good. It is defiantly average. Like, it's not bad, but it's certainly not good. Where the offense is most effective is off of play action. So what they need to do is come out and basically just run the ball for 10 straight plays on the first drive and kick a field goal or score a touchdown. But I don't think they're going to do that. I think they are going to come out and say J.J. McCarthy is capable of throwing the football a lot and being very, very good. And I think that's a possibility that he could do that, but I'm not very confident in doing that. So if I was in charge of the game plan, I would say we are going to run the ball until they stop it. And I don't think Washington's defense is capable of stopping it consistently. So I think both teams kind of come out of the gate with game plan mistakes. And then they kind of settle in and they go back into doing what they do best. And Washington gets some points on the board on 5-6 yard touchdown plays. Michigan goes on long drives, 10 to 12 plays and picks up a touchdown or a field goal or whatever. And then Washington answers right back on a 6 or 7 play drive with a deep shot or 2 thrown in there. But by the time the fourth quarter rolls around, I think maybe the midpoint of the fourth quarter, it's like 31-21. And then Washington kind of puts together a little 4 or 3 minute drive where they score a touchdown. And then all of a sudden, Michigan's got the ball back with like 3 minutes and 30 seconds on the clock. And I think they're going to just pound the ball away. And I don't see a scenario where Washington is going to be able to stop that, which is why I have Michigan winning 31-28. When you're talking about the Michigan offense, they aren't explosive, like at all. They don't throw deep balls. Literally, this entire year, they've taken like 1 or 2 truly genuine deep shots the entire season. They don't throw the ball deep. What they do is play efficient football in the passing game and efficient football in the running game, and then they go. And they keep moving the chains. They keep moving the ball. Every single time Michigan has scored this year, it's been on a long drive. And I think there's a real possibility that Michigan is able to control the pace of play. And if they can do that, they're going to win. If Washington can force this to become a shootout and force J.J. McCarthy to win the game, they have a much better chance of winning. And I just don't see how they're going to do it. Doesn't mean it can't happen. I don't see a lot of things. I didn't see Justin Herbert becoming a very good quarterback in the NFL. Okay? So there's a lot of things that I don't see. But I don't see a way where Washington is able to dictate the pace of the game. The one thing that I think throws a curveball into all of this is if Texas doesn't have those 2 fumbles, I think they win by 2 touchdowns. And Michigan doesn't turn the ball over. They just flat out and straight up don't. They don't fumble. They don't throw interceptions. And Washington's defense is very, very good at creating turnovers and specifically interceptions. However, I don't think Michigan is going to throw interceptions. I think you could have the one play with J.J. McCarthy where he throws an interception, but I'm not positive that isn't going to be gotten back by the Michigan defense at some point. But if Washington wins the turnover margin then they have a much better chance of winning this game. But for Michigan, I don't think winning the turnover margin is necessarily a necessity for them winning. Like, I don't think Michigan needs to force turnovers in order to win the game. Washington might have to force turnovers in order to win this game. But what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. And at this point, I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me at any point, or you just have something to say, then go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now with the outro out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.